Hi, everyone. My name is Zini Malik. I'm the Community Engagement and Events Specialist here at IRIS. Thank you for joining our talk today. We have some wonderful speakers, so I want to thank them. And I want to thank our event sponsor, WSHU Public Radio. Before we get started, just a couple of things. I want to mention that this talk is being recorded. And if you can just keep yourselves muted while the speakers are talking, that would be great. But please feel free to put your questions into the chat box because we will be doing a Q&A since this is a conversation. We'd love to get your questions for the speakers. And I also want to mention that IRIS is participating in the Great Give, which you've probably already heard of. This is an awesome way to support IRIS because your donations will be matched up to $35,000. So I'll be putting a link into the chat box for anybody who would like to make a donation. So now I'm going to pass it over to our wonderful moderator, Kaveh Khoshnood. He is the moderator for today's talk. Kaveh is an associate professor and director of undergraduate studies at the Yale School of Public Health and executive committee member at Yale Council on Middle East Studies. He is the co-founder of Yale Violence and Health Study Group and a faculty member of the program on conflict, resiliency, and health at the Yale Macmillan Center. And he's even a former board member at IRIS. Kaveh, always great to see you. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Zini. Welcome, everyone. I've had the pleasure of being on the board of IRIS for over a decade. And I'm so pleased that IRIS decided to host this event. Climate-induced migrants, there are multiple terms that are being used. There are definitely a large portion of the population around the world who are being displaced due to climate-related factors. And frankly, this is a relative new concept. It's not something that I've seen a lot of work done on. And I'm so glad that IRIS decided to put this panel together. We have a fantastic group of speakers representing sort of international perspective, national perspective, and a local perspective. And to get started, I'd like to introduce briefly Andrew Harper, a special advisor on climate action to the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, also known as UNHCR in Geneva. He's responsible for providing strategic guidance, oversight, and expertise to shape UNHCR's response to the climate emergency. So Andrew, I'll pass it over to you just to give us a perspective on sort of how UNHCR is thinking about this topic and sort of what's the global picture. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Kaveh, and thank you, Iris, for inviting me. So I'll try and keep this relatively short. You've mentioned that it's a relatively new sort of area. It's new in relation to the discourse. It's often been on very much the periphery of the discussions on climate emergency. But if you actually go back, certainly over the last decade or 2 decades, it has been growing in relation to, if you look at the data, it has been growing as one of the key drivers of population displacements. And it's just probably hasn't been really that connected. What people are talking about slow onset disasters and sudden onset disasters such as hurricanes as being causes of displacement. But if you actually start going back over the years, you see that climate-induced impacts has been one of the leading causes of displacement. And to this point now that probably it's almost 3 times as many people are estimated to be displaced by climate-induced factors and disasters than by conflict. And so where UNHCR is engaged in this as a UN protection agency is that climate change is also exacerbating key underlying grievances and vulnerabilities. And what we are seeing around the world is that areas which are fragile are becoming embroiled in conflict as people fight over resources, fight over their future. And this is where it starts becoming increasingly challenging to determine why people are moving, often initially internally within their country, but if they can't be provided with assistance and support and protection inside the country, then they often have to across a border. And so what we in UNHCR are trying to do is to have a better understanding of why people are being forced to move, and then looking to see how we can work with others to address the underlying root causes of that. And that's becoming increasingly a key issue across the board. So forced displacement was a peripheral issue. I would now say it's really front and center because you're starting to hear of these enormous numbers of people that may be on the move because of issues which may be directly or indirectly related to climate change. What I would like people to focus on more is not necessarily waiting for people to move, because we've probably never been in a situation as we are now where science is very clear that a warming global environment is inescapable. So we have to be much more science savvy, and we need to be better in anticipating where areas will be increasingly vulnerable and invest in those areas before people are made more vulnerable and are forced to move. How many people move in the future is largely up to how much responsibility we take as the international community to address those issues. So some of the key areas which we are focusing on at the moment, I just got off a call with colleagues in the Sahel and West Africa, because that's obviously a key area. We've got global temperatures increasing by twice the global amount within the Sahel. But what you've also got is you've got a convergence with other mega trends, such as a doubling of the population in the Sahel from something like 500 million to over 1 billion people by 2050. So how is this going to impact? How will this impact society? How will this impact security? How will this impact cities in the region? So we, as again, a protection agency, we have to be much more adaptive to a rapidly changing world. So areas like Sahel, West Africa, Southern Africa, we've seen challenges in Mozambique recently. The dry corridor, Central America, you're obviously seeing big issues there. South Asia, how is the impact going to be in India, Pakistan, also Central Asia? So there's a lot of issues that we are trying to grapple with. My position was established just over 1 year ago as recognition of the importance of treating or let's say elevating the discourse on the protection needs of people moving. We are not looking to extend mandates. We're not looking to create new international instruments in relation to climate-induced displacement. What we are trying to do is be smarter and use existing instruments and make sure that they're operationalized in a way that people feel protected and that they don't have to leave their communities in the first place. Over. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that overview. I'm going to next introduce to you Ali Noorani. Mr. Ali Nurani is the Executive Director of the National Immigration Forum, a non-partisan advocacy organization working with faith, law enforcement, and business leaders to promote the value of immigrants and immigration. Growing up in California as the son of Pakistani immigrants, Mr. Ali quickly learned how to forge alliances among people of wide-ranging backgrounds, a skill that has served him extraordinarily well as one of the nation's most innovative coalition builders. Mr. Ali Nurani, I turn it over to you.
Great, well, thank you very much. And I really appreciate Iris pulling together this conversation today. And we're just so grateful for the work that you do every single day. So I would urge people to click over to the chat, take a look at the opportunity to donate to Iris as an organization, and donate early and donate often. And again, really grateful for all the work that you do every single day. So it's interesting because, I mean, this is such an important conversation. I would kind of point to a couple of things. So we've all seen the pictures and heard the stories, and many of us through our work or our volunteer work have helped Syrian refugees resettle in the US, and perhaps we've even donated to resettlement efforts around the world for Syrian refugees. Well, it turns out that the war in Syria to a large degree was ignited by climate change. Just as the war broke out, well, before the war broke out, the country had been hit by a massive drought, and there were a number of farmers who had moved to the city to, in essence, try to make a go of it and survive. And in their protests against the Assad government, that's what led to kind of the initial conflicts that mushroomed, so that it's really one of the largest displacement crises that we've seen in our time. And we when I first saw that, I did not realize that climate change and a drought was, had set that very, very kind of perilous stage, if you will. So that's one piece. Second piece is, and then I'll kind of get into some specifics about what we're seeing in Central America and into the U.S., is that we just finished a new report in partnership with the Migration Policy Institute, the Metropolitan Group, and others, where we looked at the migration narrative around the globe, and we ended up looking at 5 different countries: the U.S., Morocco, and Mexico, and a number of others. And what we found is that there are different factors in terms of kind of telling the story about the displacement of people, but climate change is not a driving factor within the narrative, which is both a good thing and I think a bad thing. I mean, it's a good thing in that migrants are not being blamed for climate change, but it's a bad thing in that I think as people start to conflate climate change with the movement and people, unless we have a deep understanding of why that's happening and how to talk about it, it could actually, the narrative could actually end up harming both the efforts to resettle and help migrants who are moving because of climate change, much less the efforts to mitigate climate change writ large. So I'll just kind of start with those two big picture points. In Central America, we've seen really since 2014, every spring, some sort of an increase in migration from Central America: Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. And in each spring, you see, family units, single adults, but you also see a large number of unaccompanied children. And that's really the situation that we're seeing at the U.S.-Mexico border these days. But when you go back to Central America and really take a deep try to understand what's happening in the region, is a combination of factors that are pushing people. You have corruption at a federal level as well as a local level, which leads to impunity, which leads to violence, which leads to poverty. And the situations that we read about in the WLC are really quite dire. But particularly when you're talking to farmers in the highlands of these countries, or even folks whose communities were hit by the hurricanes late last year, it's pretty clear that something is happening kind of within the climate that is driving people, particularly, I believe, in the highlands, in the coffee highlands, to move. And it's interesting because when you look at a country like Honduras, nearly 40% of the Honduran labor force is employed in the coffee production sector, which means that a massive number of people are both driving the economy, but really living kind of at at the whims, if you will, of climate change. And when you look at, for example, in the first quarter of 2019, you saw the price of coffee sliding below $1 per pound for the first time in nearly 15 years. And this followed, multiple years where there were coffee leaf rusts and droughts that impacted the coffee sector in Honduras. So, it's not a surprise when we see coffee farmers or other agricultural families in rural country, or an area like rural Honduras, literally try to walk to the United States to seek protection as economic refugees. So there are all these factors that are driving this situation that I think are just very important that we all keep an eye on. One of the pieces that the Biden administration, I think, is doing quite well is that by deploying Vice President Harris to engage the governments of Central America, the government of Mexico, in addressing root causes, I think is incredibly important, both in the short term and in the long term. In the short to medium term, putting into place efforts to root out corruption, mitigate violence, lessen poverty are really important. But also, how does the vice president use the various tools that we have to offer as a nation to help mitigate climate change and really help the agricultural sector in Central America adapt to the way that, quite frankly, the environment is changing around them. From our perspective, what we're trying to do in this case is, lift up the root cause solutions that are being advocated for, whether it's by the Biden administration or, just as importantly, by NGO organizations, NGOs in Central America, but then also ensuring that we're doing everything we can as a country to treat asylum seekers at the border with compassion and humanity. Because if there's one thing that we should hold dear as a nation, is that anybody who is asking for protection within the United States should, in the least, have their cases heard in a fair and equitable manner. So happy to talk about any of these issues moving forward. But again, I just really want to thank folks for the opportunity to talk today, and thank you, folks at IRIS, for pulling this conversation together.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ali. Next, I'm going to introduce Bruni Pizarro, who's the Executive Director at Junta for Progressive Action in New Haven. Bruni's recent scholarship and advocacy centers on climate-induced disasters, colonialism, and the impact of forced migration on displaced Puerto Rican women. Her work explores how American urban inequality and the built environment shape the lived experience of Black and Latinx communities. Bruni, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Iris, for having me here and inviting me to speak on this amazing panel. I just want to start off by saying who I am in a way. I'm Bruni Pizarro. I am Puerto Rican from New York City originally. And my parents migrated to New York City as a primary destination from Puerto Rico in the 40s and 50s. And I think this is important when we speak about migration, specifically from a Puerto Rican perspective, because we are citizens of the United States. And I just kind of want to also paint that picture for you from my own personal background. But I also want to kind of talk about kind of my perspective. Of course, I have now the Junta hat as an executive director of the oldest Latinx multi-service agency in the greater New Haven area. I have that hat on when I'm speaking to you, and I'll continue to have that hat on. But what brought me to New Haven in particular was, my time at the Yale School of the Environment. I came to Yale from New York City in 2016, always thinking about the community and sort of a racialized perspective of the environment. And unfortunately, my time, as great as it was at the School of the Environment, I started thinking about, who's included in the definition of the environment and what is the built environment, and asking kind of those questions and thinking about my own culture, my own race, my own ethnicity, my own thinking about my own lived personhood, right? And others like me in that share that same identity or identities. And so when I think about the environmental field that I got into, I think about who's in that definition and who's not. And so now here we have, fast forward, that was 2016 when I entered the School of the Environment. I matriculated. Then 2017, the hurricanes hit Puerto Rico, and I heard it on the news, Category 5. And I said, oh my gosh, wow, that's terrible. And my focus wasn't necessarily on disaster at that time, although actually it was. I was looking at food insecurity in New Haven, thinking about doing my research, doing my lit reviews, learning more about New Haven since I was an outsider, but an insider in some ways, ethnically and racially with Latinx communities, but still an outsider, and trying to understand as much as I can about the landscape in New Haven. I thought about disaster in the context of food insecurity and how that still is a man-made disaster, right? It is not by accident that we have food insecurity in this country. It is not by accident that we have climate change induced disaster. It is not by accident that there's some people that are connected to that are written about in academic texts, that are ignored in academic texts. This is all part of the subjectivities of academia, the subjectivities of science, and the subjectivities related to really, from our perspective, from my perspective at least, Latinx personhood And so that motivated me to think about, in my time at Yale, think about the Latinx community, specifically in New Haven. Think about what were the migratory patterns? What are the migratory patterns of the Latinx community in New Haven, specifically the Puerto Rican community? It became a sort of identity for me, a dual identity, thinking about what happened in New Haven, who was here before I got here, why, and where are we now? 2017 hit, the hurricanes hit landfall, and I found that when I was teaching English, to just understand the community a little bit better, I was teaching English at Fairhaven School, right across the street from Junta for Progressive Action, where I now work as the executive director. Fairhaven is a predominantly Latinx community of Puerto Ricans, South Americans, Mexicans, Central Americans. It's a Latinx hotspot in many ways. And it's we're located on the thoroughfare of Fairhaven. So I said, you know what, I'm gonna do my work in Fairhaven. Reminds me of home. And there's a true connection with the work that I did volunteering as an instructor for English for free, basically a volunteer, and seeing that these hurricane displacees that were coming from Puerto Rico a month after the hurricanes hit landfall in Puerto Rico were in my class trying to learn English. And they were going to Junta for Progressive Action. I'm pretty sure that they were going to IRIS as well, because we have partnerships with the city, which is amazing during this time of crisis. And so I was in the thick of things. And I said, oh my gosh, but here I am at the Yale School of the Environment, and we're learning about all these theories and climate change from a global level, which is really important, of course, but now at the local level, what does it mean to embody disaster? What does it mean when social services are considered social services for social services' sake, and we're not contextualizing it within the framework of climate change and climate change induced disaster? And when you think about, much like the speaker, one of the speakers mentioned, he talked about, Andrew talked about vulnerabilities, and not in the intersections of those vulnerabilities, meaning gender, being Puerto Rican. What does that look like? And what does it look like from a migratory perspective? Who was here before and why? And so I'd love to get into that a little bit more, to have that conversation, because it really, really started to characterize migration in the climate era in New Haven and throughout. Why did people choose to come to New Haven? Those were a lot of the questions that I was asking myself. So I have a few minutes, but if y'all want to know more about that, feel free to ask. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to, again, I encourage all the participants to put in their questions in the chat box, but I'm going to start with just asking a couple of questions. And actually, Bruni, I'm going to start with you. You mentioned the hurricanes in Puerto Rico, and you did mention that shortly after the hurricanes, quite a few Puerto Ricans, I don't know exactly the number, came to New Haven, and sort of Junta, your organization, became sort of ground zero for these families who were trying to resettle. Could you shed some light on sort of how that happened, and how did you guys manage those individuals?
Such a good question, and thank you so much for the question. So during that time, there's always, American inequality and marginalization have existed for a very, very long time, and it's not only happening now in the COVID-19 era. When you think about the pandemic and how that's exacerbated, people's lived experience and the quality of life, but also climate change induced disaster. So the Latinx folk that came were already, underprivileged in their homeland, in their communities. They were, characterized in the media as somewhat hopeless and helpless, but they weren't. They were surviving, and they are survivors. And they decided, each and every one of them had a different story. And so my work captured that story. But then when I came to Junta and worked with Junta as a student, because I wasn't an executive director at the time, I was a grad student, understanding at the time, what does the landscape look like? we saw a lot of our participants living in FEMA hotels, having to deal with extended deadlines and really getting scared and fearing that they would get kicked out of the FEMA hotels that they were in. And understanding that sort of lived experience of this sort of trauma-based understanding of what disaster does long-term is unclear. And I haven't seen that in many articles, journal articles. My focus was really trying to capture those stories because I knew that it, you know, and even with translating those stories, you lose something because it goes through a researcher or someone who's interviewing. So you have to distill those stories. But what I learned from those experiences is that Junta was there in partnership with IRIS, with the city of New Haven, with Fairhaven Health, with FEMA. We had FEMA representatives at Junta stationed there from Texas. They came from all over. And Junta became ground zero. Why is that? I think that really Junta has, in the 52 years that we've been in operation, we have been a cultural oasis for the community. We have people from Puerto Rico during the earthquakes who have called us. We're not even marketing to Puerto Rico or doing outreach, who have called us and said, hey, the earthquakes hit in Puerto Rico. I'm in Puerto Rico. Can y'all help me out if I go there? You got my back? And we're like, of course we do. And we're here to help. So Junta did not market themselves as being like climate change induced experts but we are resettlement experts. We are disaster resettlement experts. And now in the COVID-19 era, which is another disaster, we're seeing that we're actually now crises managers, crises with an ES, because these are cumulative burdens that are affecting our community's health, emotional health, physical health, and overall well-being. So it's really a partnership, and it's a lot of heart. It's a lot of cultural sort of sensitivity and sort of adapting to the moment and being there. And you know, it's a calling, really.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Ali Nurani. I think you mentioned your organization works with a number of partners, faith community, law enforcement, business community. What kind of work takes place within these collaborations, and how have these groups responded to promotion of immigrants and immigration, and what are some of the challenges of working with these very multiple sectors?
Sure. So, you know, the forum itself was founded in 1982. Our mission is to advocate for the value of immigrants and immigration to the nation. And back in, I would say, 2011, we made a decision to really focus the majority of our resources on conservative and moderate voters in the Southeast, the Midwest, and the Mountain West, because that's where we realized at a national level, we needed to pick up and build support for immigrants and immigration. Looking at those regions, we realized that it was going to be important that we engaged evangelical leaders, law enforcement, and business leaders. And in that way, we built out this kind of umbrella coalition that's come to be known as Bibles, Badges, and Business for Immigration Reform. And the idea is that if you hold a Bible, you wear a badge, or you own a business, you want a common sense solution to the immigration system. And what that's meant, Kaveh, is that we as an organization have had to really understand what people are afraid of, what their concerns are, and then develop communications and organizing and even policy strategies to address those fears, but ultimately to advance constructive reforms at the federal or the state level. So it's really been some kind of careful kind of coalition building and kind of management of not conflicting interests, because, you know, this has probably been the easiest work that, you know, I'll ever do, because people want to be a part of a solution, but it's a conflicting language. And, you know, it's a matter of kind of meeting people where they are, but just not leaving them there.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Andrew. Andrew, you kind of gave us a sense of sort of the big picture. I'm wondering, does UNHCR have particular concerns about specific regions of the world to be particularly vulnerable to climate-related sort of disasters? And what kinds of sort of natural disasters is the UNHCR most concerned about?
Okay, I think we're worried about the whole world at the moment, given the trends that we're seeing. There are areas which are being hit by a combination of cascading disasters, and we've seen that in Central America recently, where you have one hurricane after another hurricane hitting almost the same regions, so that populations don't have the ability to build up their resilience to get on with life. I think what we've had in the past is that you'd have areas which would be impacted by extreme weather event once in every 10 years, once every 20 years. But what we're seeing now is it's happening almost every year. And this is just leading to, as I mentioned before, increased vulnerability. Populations are not having that opportunity in which to rebuild their lives, regroup their assets to survive the next disaster. So we're looking at areas which are going to be impacted more and more by these extreme weather events. And again, we're seeing that in Central Asia. Sorry, not Central Asia. We're seeing that in Central America. We're seeing it in South Asia as well, in Bay of Bengal, which has already got issues in regards to the conflict in Myanmar. We're seeing it in East Africa, where you're seeing unprecedented floods combined with droughts. So what you're seeing, what we have is long periods of no rain, and then when the rain comes, it comes down in a massive torrent, which also destroys the infrastructure. And that's sort of also leading to the undermining of infrastructure, both physical and social infrastructure, which then leads to the potential for increased social instability. So Central America, Southern Asia, East Africa, Horn of Africa, the Sahel, which has got a combination of both slow onset, which is desertification, also environmental degradation, also in Southern Africa as well, as I mentioned before, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, these areas are also of concern. On top of that, in relation to slow onset, you've got desertification, but you've also got sea level rise. And we're working closely with small island developing states, and particularly those countries in South Pacific, Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia. They are already seeing displacement because part of their territory is going underwater. And so the issues of what happens to populations when their territory is completely submerged are issues which we have to grapple with. There'll still be states, but what happens if the territorial integrity of those states no longer exists? So some of the issues which the West are only now just grappling with, because we've not necessarily had to experience them, have been at the front and center of many of these small islands' concerns for years. And so Fiji, Tuvalu, despite being quite small states, are being at the very heart of questions in relation to how the world should be much more active in protecting people who are being displaced due to no fault of their own because of climate change and the rising sea levels. On top of that, we're seeing other areas where the territorial integrity may not necessarily be compromised as a whole, but you've got areas throughout Southeast Asia where populations will have to move. We're already seeing it in Indonesia, for instance. Jakarta will probably have to move to another location. You've got parts of obviously Bangladesh, but also across the whole region, you're going to have populations that are going to have to move. Unfortunately, the numbers we just don't know, because it will then depend on levels of mitigation, support to adaptation. But we are talking huge numbers, unprecedented numbers of people are going to have to adjust. And where will they go? And does the infrastructure exist to deal with them, like you deal with public health? What is going to be the public health situation and consequences of tens of millions of people having to move to locations which have not been properly established for them. On top of that, as a magnifier of this vulnerability, and I'll just give the example of East Africa at the moment. You've got drought followed by major flooding, but then on top of that, you have a situation where those major floods are then leading to locust plagues, which then, if everyone has survived, their livelihoods are still are just enough to keep them alive, then you have this sort of biblical situation of locust plagues coming through and wiping out everything else. So it's not just looking about the weather and seeing what's going to happen in the near future. It's the consequences of it. And again, as I mentioned at the start, if we already understand where different regions of the world are going to be particularly vulnerable to the impact of climate change, both slow onset and sudden onset, what are we doing in order to build up the resilience of these populations? There's no reason for us to be surprised when people have to move. Like, we already know those areas. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. If I can just build on what you were saying, many of the people who are in vulnerable communities who are being displaced due to climate-related and other factors often end up not in very high-income countries. They don't end up in Europe or United States. They usually go right next door to the next country over, which is likely to be also a low middle income country without a lot of capacity, educational capacity, healthcare capacity, etc. Can you give us a sense of what's the international conversation about building the capacity of these host nation or transit countries, whatever you want to call them? I'm thinking of over 1 million Syrians who were displaced into Lebanon. Lebanon already has its own multiple disasters and limited resources, etc. So now you've got an extra 1 million people coming to a country of about 5 million people. How is the educational needs of those individuals, the health needs are going to be addressed? So what's the international conversation about this?
Yeah, it's good that you raised that point. Prior to my current job, I was the rep in Jordan, where I was having to deal with the same situation of having 1 million Syrians coming across. And if you look at the resources available, the water resources available in a country like Jordan, very scarce. I've already had to deal with a Palestinian population as well. So what is the discourse? The discourse is that the international community is not doing enough, has never done enough in order to compensate countries who are doing the right thing internationally as far as burden sharing and providing protection to meet the needs. So what we have focused on, particularly I would say in the last 10 years, is an increasing emphasis on just building refugee camps and providing tents and water and minimal food is not enough. We have to be looking at how do you support the host states in development. And as a consequence, over the last few years, including with the signing of the Global Compact on Refugees, we've been looking to work with development actors, large states, to see how they can support hosting states in a much more, let's say, pragmatic, sustainable manner. Because if you don't, you mentioned before that some neighboring states could be transit states. Well, people, as we all know, they don't necessarily want to leave their communities. They don't want to be forced to cross borders and go to a country where they may not feel welcome. And they will try and stay within their own country. And it's important that when we look at people displaced by climate and environment, 80% of them stay within their own country. So this is where the issue of climate refugees. Refugees cross an international frontier due to conflict and persecution. The vast majority of people don't want to cross an international frontier, but if they've got no choice, if you've got children, if you've got to survive, you will do what is necessary. And so what we've been saying to the international community is the level of population movements in the future, you are directly responsible for. You either look at one, trying to mitigate future increases in relation to climate change. You look at trying to provide mitigation and adaptation programs in countries which are going to be at most at risk. And if people are forced to move, for God's sake, do whatever you can to help those states who are doing the right things, because 90% of refugees originate from states which are really at the front and center of the climate disaster. Like, they don't have the capacity to provide any more protection or support. So it's really a combination that the international community cannot isolate itself. It cannot build a wall against the impact of climate, not when climate is going to become increasingly let's say a hostile stakeholder. Like what we've done is we've basically picked a fight with an enemy that we'll lose to. So we have to basically start making arrangements.
Thank you. I'm curious what's the conversation looks like in the United States, and maybe I can start with Mr. Ali Noorani. I know the Biden administration seems to be paying attention to this topic, but are you aware of any plans? Are they getting ready to deal with perhaps, I've seen numbers of about 4 million people in the next few decades who will be displaced and coming to the United States. What is the conversation like in a national level that you're aware of?
Well, I mean, Andrew might have a better sense of kind of what the administration is putting into motion on a day-to-day perspective, or from a policy perspective. But from our vantage point, what we're seeing is that for the first time, whether it's DHS or state or other agencies, there are two questions that are being grappled with: is okay, what will global migration look like? But also, okay, where does climate change fit into the creation of that pressure for the movement of people? So a lot of the early hires really began to kind of, or early kind of positioning of the agencies under new political leadership began to ask that question. From our perspective, I would love to see, for example, Secretary Kerry, who is, the president's climate czar, be much more directive in terms of, talking about climate solutions as they're related to migration. My sense is that the Secretary of State understands that this is an issue that needs to be addressed and really thought of, but they're taking a long time. For example, there's an assistant secretary position for population, refugees, and migration that within the State Department would be a really critical role in terms of holding the flag, not just on the future of displaced people, but how it's connected to climate change. So I think it's probably a little bit early in terms of what the Biden administration could be doing. But I think what we need to be keeping our eyes on is what are the policy or what are the personnel decisions they're making. But it also kind of goes back to earlier to what I was saying in terms of the report that we just finished. And I think we also just have to acknowledge that kind of in the migration narrative, this issue of climate change is not part of that conversation. So I think conversations like this and discussions like this in a public way need to be happening more and more often so that it just really starts to filter across the landscape.
Thank you. Bruni, I'm curious if there's conversation happening in City of New Haven. And I'm, of course, also thinking of the mayor, our new mayor, Justin Elliker. I believe he's a graduate of the same school that you went to, School of Environment. So he does understand environmental factors. Has there been a conversation in New Haven about potential number of migrants who will be coming due to climate-related factors from Puerto Rico or other places?
Well, the City of New Haven has been so amazing since day one on being our partners. I really want to give almost like a shout out to Rick Fontana from the Office of Emergency Management. He's just been our ace and has been working to track trends, connect with other nonprofit, sort of private public partnerships, and has really been a gem, and also at the core of like trying to understand the landscape. I was on the transition team for Mayor Elicker, and right before he got inaugurated, and I was part of the sort of environmental task force aspect of his transition team. And so I can tell you from my conversations with him and being on his transition team, that he's definitely dedicated and passionate about this city, as well as the future prospects of climate change impacting the New Haven landscape. So we've been in conversations, but there's just so much to this. It's so complex, right? Because we had the hurricanes in 2017, and then we had in Puerto Rico, and then we had the earthquakes, a series of earthquakes in 2019. And so we were working even more closely together, at least the city of New Haven and the mayor and Rick Fontana, on tracking trends post earthquakes. And that happened early 2020. And we were there with our partners. So we kind of came together again for this sort of disaster committee, specifically looking at Puerto Rican earthquake displacees and resettlement efforts. And so we're ready, we're primed and ready. The scale of New Haven is such that I think it's a lot easier to work on resettlement efforts in a size like a scalable, well, a city like New Haven in its scale versus a New York City, let's say. It's a smaller city, people know each other, partners, collaborators, nonprofits, the city of New Haven employees, departments, they've had long-lasting relationships. And I think that that's what makes New Haven special. And so these conversations are ongoing, but I really think it's interesting to think about COVID-19 and its impact on these same people that we saw in 2017 and 2018, and now in 2020 with the earthquakes. But it's just disaster after disaster after disaster for some folks. And I think that that's the hardest part to connect, is really that embodiment of disaster and all the intersectional aspects of that. So where do we start? For me, it starts with trust building and really having that cultural capital that at least Junta has, and that trust that we've built for over 50 years with the community. They know what they're going to get when they come to Junta. And I think I think a good strategy is imploring nonprofits like Junta, who are BIPOC led, who are doing the work, who understand the community very, very well, and its nuances and its complexities, to then start thinking about climate adaptation in a way that's culturally sensitive, that really understands all the sort of identities and intersections and needs. That's something that just can't be glossed over. It can't be theorized necessarily. Not that I'm against theory, I think it's important, but I think in practice, there definitely has to be a lot of imagination. And I think it's important for BIPOC-led organizations who know this community very well to be at the table and also be part of the decision-making process. Thank you.
Sure. I'm sure that Junta is linked to similar organizations throughout the nation. Is that a conversation that's happening nationwide with other nonprofits like Junta? And by the way, I'm also curious with the Iris is having conversation, but we don't have an Irish speaker on the panel. I know, although Chris George is here. Are refugee resettlement agencies seeing climate-induced migrant as a population that they also need to be thinking about?
Chris, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, and so having worked with Human Rights Watch for a couple of years, I am well aware that there have been a number of challenges to the fairly strict definition of refugee, and there is an effort. I mean, right now the definition is someone who has fled their home country because of persecution, either a well-founded fear of persecution, or they've actually been persecuted, and they have to prove it. But there have been challenges for decades to that definition, that there should be social and climate and economic refugees as well. That the conditions they face are really, in some ways tantamount to persecution, and climate clearly discriminates against those without power in countries. So I think we'll see some changes. Right now, working with the Department of State in the refugee resettlement program, we are restricted to the current definition of a refugee. It doesn't prevent us from striking out on our own, and of course welcoming and providing services to people who have fled for climate-related reasons.
Thank you for that. I see a question in the chat box. I don't know who can answer that, but question is, within the United States, what states are likely to experience climate crises that will force state-to-state migration? Anybody would like to jump in on that one?
I just know that I used to live in Boston for 10 years near Connecticut. It's just too cold for me, so I'm not moving north. I can guarantee you that in terms of climate-induced migration. So sorry, Gay, good to see you.
I remember hearing a story on NPR actually just a few days ago about Vermont being a place where a lot of people are considering moving to because of climate-related factors. So the prices is going up in Vermont, but let me see if there's any other. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can mention when Hurricane Katrina hit the southern states, a number. I mean, we all remember thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, people left the Gulf region for other states, including Connecticut, and Junta and IRIS, as well as other organizations, stepped forward and assisted them. So, I don't think we're going to see the end of it. I think we're going to see more and more of it. And refugee resettlement agencies that traditionally help refugees from overseas may be contracted and enlisted to help U.S. citizens.
I see a response from Tabitha saying that southern states seem to be at higher risk, especially Texas, Louisiana, and Florida. We are getting close to the end. If there are any last minute questions, I think I see California also was mentioned as being heavily impacted over the last 3 years. There is a question about what can people do, whether they're students, whether they're healthcare workers, or whatever they may be. I wonder what any of you would like to say about what is it that just individuals can do to mitigate this problem. Anybody
I'd like to start, actually,
Please.
if that's okay. I wanted to just quickly address that, plus add a little bit of, maybe a little bit of texture to what I said earlier. I think in terms of migration and looking at the Puerto Rican experience in the States, at least in New Haven and thinking about migration, right before the hurricane struck in 2017, there were severe austerity measures in Puerto Rico. And I think that's something that should be noted because people were having, schools were shutting down. There were, healthcare was becoming less and less accessible, and people were already migrating to the mainland of the United States. And a lot of the people that we were seeing had sisters, family members, friends, and loved ones who that were already here, that came maybe 5 or 6 years or 3 years before the hurricane struck. And that was their avenue to come into New Haven. That was one of the major things that were cited. And I think that's a really interesting connection of having that sort of lifeline outside of the archipelago. And for what reason? And I think it's important in answer to your question to really, really, really read as much as we can and get ourselves informed about those specific nuances, because it is climate change induced, yes, but in certain areas, in the case of Puerto Rico, there were a lot of austerity measures that happened right before the hurricane struck, and there was a $70 billion debt in Puerto Rico. And these are things that, and Puerto Rico was supposed to pay it back, but it was just all these sort of pressure points of, is that appropriate, is that not? And you can read, Naomi Klein's Battlefield for Paradise book to give you a little bit more information on that. She really goes into it. But these are the kinds of readings and we should inform ourselves about what's happening politically, economically, socially in these areas where they're getting hit. So that is, like, I think, important to contextualize. And also it is a racial, for us, at least for me, I see things from a racialized, gendered perspective, class-based perspective. Who are the people that are most vulnerable and why are they going through this? And coming to communities like the communities that Junta serves, it's important to have that perspective, because if not, we're just saving people and no one really needs to be saved. We just need people to work with us to help, to serve others, right? In community, for us to continue to do the work. So I would encourage you all to, open your hearts and minds and really think about this contextually, because there's so many things from a historical perspective that are upstream that lead to the downstream impacts. So what I've been talking about are the downstream impacts. What Andrew was talking about, what Ali was talking, those are more of the upstream impacts, the core, what is happening, why, how is it happening? We're here saying, hey, we're here to pick up the pieces a little bit. And I wish that we wouldn't have to do that, but we're in that position. We definitely could use help in the future, now and in the future, and support. But really having that open mind and that transformative perspective as to this work is really, really important.
Thank you so much. I do see a question from Cami, which asks, the Biden administration has ordered a 6-month study on climate migration, which is a good start, but what should be the next big step or priority the administration should take to prepare United States immigration policy for climate migration? Big question. I don't know who wants to take that on. Go ahead, Andrew.
Even before we start looking at climate migration, I think what we as protection agencies has been really grappling with is just the reduction in resettlement places, just like due to conflict refugees from the very start. So what we would be looking at is, or encouraging or hoping for, is for the US just to, again, re-engage at the level it was a number of years ago in regards to resettlement of refugees, and also looking potentially where you have climate and conflict being a nexus, because what we are seeing is that where you have people driven from a combination of conflict and climate-induced events, the ability for them to return is almost zero. And so this is now also translating to an increase in the protracted nature of refugee settlements, because in the past we had situations where the conflict would end and people would be able to return. What we're seeing is that these conflicts are extending, they're not being resolved, but also the environment in which people fled is also no longer suitable for being able to sustain a population if they could return. So this potential for people being displaced for longer periods due to this combination of conflict and climate needs to be sort of taken much more seriously. But first, one, we're so happy that the US is back on the agenda as far as protection of people are concerned. But we also have to make up a lot of lost ground in relation to hundreds of thousands of people who probably would have been resettled around the world but haven't been over the last years. And how do we sort of catch up for those people who are both made even more vulnerable due to that combination of conflict and climate? Over.
Thank you so much. We've reached the end. I want to thank Andrew, Ali, and Bruni, our 3 wonderful speakers. Really appreciated your thoughts and perspectives on this really important topic. And again, I want to thank Iris for hosting this panel. It's incredibly timely and important. So thank you, and thank you to all the participants. There are a couple of resources that was shared on the chat, so feel free to access those. I see some reports, etc. So feel free to look at that. Thank you again, and wish everybody a wonderful afternoon. Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here, and particularly to our speakers, Bruni, Andrew, and Kaveh, our wonderful moderator, and Ali. And hopefully we'll see you for more community conversations in the fall. Have a
Thank you
great
very
rest
much.
of your week, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Kaveh.
Thank you.